Okay, now we're recording. Okay, what else can I say? I'm going to try to keep the intro as brief as I can. I do want to note that this talk has been sponsored by Camosun's Sustainability Office, the Camosun College Student Society, the CUPE 1083, which is the local staff union at Camosun, as well as the Camosun College Faculty Association. It's a nice broad kind of coalition of sponsors, which I think gives you some sense for the interest in this topic. Now, why are we doing this now? I wanted to say a couple of words about that. I don't know about you all. I'm a bit preoccupied with the pandemic, of course, but I've noticed that even still with that huge global event getting in the way, there still seems to be 2081. I'm so sorry, I said 1083. Thanks, Christine from CCSS. Okay, so, global weather events have been pretty extreme lately. I feel like there's an increasing amount of interest in the subject of the global climate crisis out there in the public, in spite of the pandemic going on. And so, as someone who's been teaching about weather and climate for almost 20 years now at Camosun, this has been on my radar for a long time, but I feel like even with all our other distractions in life, it's growing in people's consciousness. So I feel that there's an interest, and the broad sort of representation that we've found in our C4 group, I think kind of supports that. I also wanted to note that here at the college, I think it's a good moment to be having a talk on climate action. Just about a year ago, our Board of Governors formally voted to explore making a climate emergency declaration, which I think they rightly want to be going along with some real action on the ground at Camosun. There's a renewal of our strategic plan, which is going to be happening soon, which will include, we hope, sustainability actions that can happen. And particularly, we hope to see something serious on the climate side of things. And, we also just happen to have a new president on the ground here at Camosun College, and I believe he's in the audience or is meant to be. So I can't see that from here, but we have, I hope, Lane Trotter here somewhere in the virtual room. So anyway, that's, I think, maybe just enough background about why now. If you're here, you probably understand why we're talking about this now. Okay, so now the next thing I wanted to do is just briefly acknowledge that I am personally on the territory of the Lekwungen people here in Victoria. Camosun also has, a campus on WSÁNEĆ territory. I think there's a good chance that there are people in the audience that are from other First Nations territories, and feel free to put those in the chat, if that seems appropriate to you. But, and I'm originally from Abenaki territory myself in the eastern townships of Quebec. But I don't want to go on about that too long because I think we can do better. We were privileged to have a welcome recorded for us by Della Rice Sylvester, who is an elder with the Cowichan tribes up in Duncan. And so she was hoping to be with us for this, but then she had a conflict, so she couldn't make it in a live way. But I do have a video recording of Della's welcome, which I'd like to share with you right now as an extension of that land acknowledgement. So just bear with me for a moment while I get that going for you. Now we're going to just make Della full screen. And I believe you should be able to hear this.
Hojko, CM. Hojko, CM. Hojko, CM. Hojko, CM. This is Gachmin, wild Indian celery seed, Lomatium nudicale, lake sage, cedar, sweetgrass. We light the candle to take the negative energy. Hi, Misie is my name, Della Rice Sylvester from the Camosun tribes. And I'd like to welcome you here to this land. We use the sage, we use the sweetgrass, we use the Devil's Club to clarify the air. This is Devil's Club. This is Devil's Club. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Ichu stomo chilini, hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha. See the people standing round, by that I mean, look at the ground. All the people living round us, trees and rocks and stones, water going by in our community. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha. See the changes coming through. Gila hey, hunnu ha. They adapt just like me and you. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Hunnu ha, hunnu ha. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Getali no hiya, kuitana we can he, balana, oh yeah, we know he, we know he, we know. St. John's Wort. Hunnu hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, hunnu ha. Ketala, we know hey, hunnu ha, hunnu hey, huya. Tita, kilo, oyo. Balono yo, ono yo, ono yo, hey yo, no hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hello yo, ono yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey qua, hey qua, hey yo. Hey yo, hey yo, hey yo. One sage. Smells nice. Some sweetgrass, sage, Devil's Club, cedar. All of these things we use for like a smudge to clarify the air, and all of these things like the sage is vitamin A, healing at the cell level. If anybody's spazzing and anxiety, you can use your sage for drinking as tea, for smudging like a smoke, for clarifying and clearing and grounding you. Up, feet straight on the floor, feet not crossed when you're listening to all of these kinds of things. When you want to remember, If your feet are crossed, Grandma will say it goes in one ear and out the other and can't stay. Got it. Hulok up. Hono kilo cholo. And the biggest piece that Grandma said all the time was teach the kids. If they don't know it, then teach them. If they can't see it, then show them. Let them look. Take a look at it. See it, taste it, walk it, touch it. The land all knows you where you walk. Wherever you walk, the land knows you. Every single piece of plant that you walk by, they know you. They'll be a help to you if you ask them. The water will be a help. The sand will be a help. The candle light will be a help to clear you off. Let's head up equal. Look, woman is for more sandwich. Pick it all up. Cut that out. Oh no. Hola now, yeah, Hoyt go, CM. Hoyt means thank you, and Halkamilum. CM means somebody greater than yourself. Hoyt go, CM. Hoyt go, CM. Yes, you can sing with me. Hoyt go, CM. Hoyt go, CM. Hoyt go, CM. Hoyt go. Good.
Wow. Sorry, everyone. I gapped out for a second there with my technical problems, but I'm back. I hope you enjoyed that introduction and welcome from Della. I felt like it was a real privilege for me to be able to record that with her. We had an amazing conversation about the changes that she sees on the land in, with the changing climate and other environmental things up in the Cowichan area. So I feel like that gets us off on the right foot here. So without further ado, let me introduce Seth. So Seth Klein is with us. Some of you will remember Seth from his work with the BC chapter of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA. And most recently, Seth, of course, is working on climate action. You'll have seen his book, A Good War, in our promotions, and hopefully some of you may have read it. I read it this fall and was really knocked out. Seth has a background in pacifism, and yet ironically now he is using the war effort of the Second World War as a sort of a metaphor and a call to action for us. And so at this point, I'd like to hand it over to you, Seth. Thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Am I coming through okay?
Loud and clear.
Very good. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. As the sun starts to set here, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Chris. My thanks to Della for that lovely opening, that grounding opening. For the clear direction, I will confess, I think at a certain point there, my legs were crossed, but then they quickly uncrossed. So thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for making time. It's good to see these numbers. I'm looking at the chat. It's nice to see a mix of Camosun faculty and staff and students. And thank you to all the groups that came together to make this happen. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. just across the strait in Vancouver. And as Chris mentioned, I'm going to be speaking for less than 40 minutes because I think it's always nice to have a good amount of time for Q&A, but drawing upon my book, here it is, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. But I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion with you all. So for all of us who are British Columbians, this year that we just finished was really something. It was a year of reckoning with the climate emergency, wasn't it? First, we had this extreme heat dome event in June that shattered temperature records and robbed us of almost 600 of our fellow British Columbians in less than a week. And I want to drive home this point. That June heat dome event was the most deadly weather event in Canadian history. And most of those who perished were isolated lower income seniors. And it was preventable. If those homes that they lived in had already been unplugged from gas and converted to electric heat pump systems, which also cool in the summer, as we urgently need to do to lower our greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings, very likely every one of those people would still be with us. And of course, that heat dome event culminated with, most dramatically, with the burning to the ground of basically the entire town of Lytton. Then we had this summer of incredible forest fires. And then in November, we all had a new term introduced into our lexicon, atmospheric river. And we experienced these mudslides and flooding that wreaked complete havoc on Abbotsford and Princeton and Merritt and numerous Indigenous communities, drowned about 650,000 farm animals, killed another 5 people, and inflicted billions of dollars in damage at the household level and business level, and to all of us collectively in terms of public infrastructure. I mean, what a year. Many of us, I think, are wrestling with growing feelings of grief and anxiety as we witness these unfolding disasters. You know, it seems like we're emerging from one crisis, the pandemic, and stumbling into the next, sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire. And I'm struck by this irony that we, you know, when you look at this incredible response that we saw to the flooding, for example, you know, these amazing displays of social solidarity, you know, neighbors helping neighbors and communities mobilizing, Sikh community mobilizing to help people after the floods, and our government mobilizing to help. And yet, ironically, we're at this odd stage where we mobilize to put fires out, but not to prevent them, to rescue people from floods, but not to prevent them. And I'm struck too that, you know, very often we hear this term in the media about these events being the new normal. But, you know, it isn't the new normal. It's but a taste of things to come. And for all of us who've lived through this pandemic these last 2 years, if you thought the last 2 years of pandemic living were disruptive, I'm afraid we haven't seen anything yet if we don't get serious about the climate crisis. Because as disruptive as COVID was, it didn't upend our food and water systems the way the climate crisis is and will. And as anxiety producing as the pandemic was, it doesn't have the same physical effects as extreme heat does, right? And we all experienced some of that in the heat dome. In the pandemic, remember particularly in the early months when we used to gather outside our homes at 7 o'clock and bang pots and pans, struck me that particularly in that first period, most of us became our best selves. But extreme heat messes with our brains and with our capacity to cope just when we most need to be our best selves. And then also last August, as if we needed any more proof, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 200 plus of the world's top climate scientists, offered up yet another terrifying warning that we are on borrowed time. So make no mistakes, folks. We indeed confront an emergency. And if we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the coming decades, things get very grim. A world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, and quite possibly ungovernable. So it is an ecological crisis that we are facing, but, and I want to emphasize this point, it is just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. And for all of you who are teachers on this Zoom call at your college, and those of you who are students, this crisis will be the defining issue of the rest of your lives and your students' lives. And you all need to be thinking and learning together about what this is going to mean for your futures and your careers, and how we all cope and adapt, and how together we confront this crisis. And that's the last of the scary news that you're going to hear from me this evening. Instead, for all of you who, like me, are feeling deeply anxious, let me offer two reflections from my study of emergencies. So my book study of the Second World War, that emergency, and this shared experience we've had of the pandemic, and now this period of the climate emergency. I want to offer two observations that I hope provide some solace. The first is this: all emergencies start with a period of denial. Let me repeat that. All emergencies start with a period of denial. And then my second observation is that at some point, some sort of alchemy occurs, a special combination of events and leadership that shifts the popular zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. And when that happens, these emergencies, once recognized, transform us. They transform our society, our social relations, our economy, and our leaders. Think about these three crises, these three emergencies I mentioned. Think about Canada on the brink of World War II, right? A lot of people kind of, we loosely think back to that time and we think, oh, it was an emergency and everyone was immediately ready to rally. Not true. Both the public and leadership were in fact in denial right up to the 11th hour. And then despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that, even as the winds of war were gathering in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary. And even once the war was declared, historian Jack Granatstein described the early months as one of Canada wanting to prosecute what he dubbed a limited liability war. And historians refer to the first 9 months of the war as the phony war. And it strikes me that if you had asked Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy as was about to happen? I'm quite certain most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang. And they had no reason to believe otherwise, because the same group had done mostly nothing in the face of a 10-year depression. But then that alchemy of events and leadership, events like the fall of France in June of 1940, and leadership that had to move the public into emergency mode. Now, fast forward to the present, think about the pandemic, right? Remember when we all first started to hear about this new virus 2 years ago? We were all in denial, weren't we, about how it was about to upend our lives. And then that alchemy of events and leadership. I don't know what events you remember. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. Now, I don't even watch basketball, but I remember when that happened thinking, wow, this is different. But I also remember that it took seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning, giving us those briefings, right? That communicated that something different was afoot. And like those Canadians in 1938, if you had asked me a few months earlier, do I think there are people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada capable of quickly pivoting in the space of weeks and creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? I hate to say it, I would have said, no, there's no one home there who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong, because they were able to pivot. And then we come to the climate emergency. And at some level, we're all still in some state of denial, right? Not yet ready to leap into a grand transition. And certainly our political and business leaders are as well, for the most part, still in denial. Let me be clear what I mean by denial. They're not in denial about the reality of human-induced climate change for the most part, but they are in denial about what confronting it actually requires. But it's all of us too, making these futile little bargains that we make with the laws of nature. Please just a little more time with this vehicle, or one more trip, or please just a few more barrels of oil, or my personal favorite at the moment, please just let us have this pipeline and we promise to use the money to fund the transition. The alchemy's first ingredient, the transformative events, those are already occurring. That's what these extreme weather events are. Although unhelpfully, they don't all occur everywhere at the same time, and so we're not all galvanized at once. But the alchemy's second ingredient, the leadership, is not there yet. But look, so it was in 1939, right? Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hope to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And I feel like that's where we find ourselves today in this similar period of this is the time of our phony war, right? Where 2 summers ago, the federal government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and then proceeds with reapproving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day, right? That's the phony war, but I don't think it's going to last. I think it's about to end. So I hope and believe that my book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And the book endeavors to, on the one hand, tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, but I've also been very gratified since it came out that for the most part, people are finding the book unusually hopeful. Its original twist, as I've alluded to, and as the title suggests, is that it is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. And as Chris alluded to in his introduction, there's no irony in me coming to this framework that I'm invoking. And I want to acknowledge that. I cut my political activism teeth as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. And I am, moreover, the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is, in fact, how I happen to be Canadian. But despite that personal history, I'm now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and to galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And why do we need a new approach? I want to screen share with you for a moment and show you a little graph. There you are. Hope you're seeing that. This is a chart showing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years. By the way, if I were to show you British Columbia's greenhouse gas emissions, the lines look basically the same. Now I've got a little hat tip here to Greta Thunberg, who aptly describes all of our climate promises to date as so much blah, blah, blah. Now, let this chart sink in for a moment. What you basically see there for Canada, same for BC, little ups and downs, but it's basically a flat line. Our GHG emissions plateaued at an historic high. To put this in the language we now understand from the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. In short, we are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our kids and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, and where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. And here we all are, staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we urgently have to do and what our politics seems willing or capable of entertaining. And somehow we have to kickstart something new. I just want to check in and make sure that you're able to see me okay and I'm coming through okay. So far, so good? Great. So I didn't actually start off planning to write a war story. The book project began as an exploration of how we tackle that gap. How do we align our politics and economy in Canada on the one hand with what the science says we urgently have to do on the other? The book does tackle that gap, but in the original book outline, I had only planned to have a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I'd long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that research, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around that history, because I see in that history this helpful and in fact hopeful reminder that we've done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy, twice in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. So for all of us who wonder, who follow the science and who worry, can we really do what we need to do in the short window of time that we have? The answer is, well, yeah, theoretically we can, because we have. So the book explores what wartime scale mobilization could actually mean and look like, and each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did in the war and what we now face. Now, since releasing the book, and I've given a lot of talks and interviews, invariably people ask, how do you know when a government actually gets the emergency? And in trying to answer that question, it forced me to distill this 400-page book into what I now call my 4 markers of emergency. And these are the framework, the markers are the framework that I and my team now employ at the Climate Emergency Unit, which is the outfit I now work with, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in Q&A. So I'm going to show you the 4 markers in a second. They were, and they are markers for when you know that a government has genuinely shifted into emergency mode. The markers were written for governments, particularly at the federal and provincial level, but they apply just as much to any large institution, an economic sector, a crown corporation, a union, a pension fund, a faith institution, and I say to you good folks at Camosun, a post-secondary institution. So as I walk you through these markers, as I'm about to do, I want to reflect with you as well on the question of what would it look like for Camosun to hit these markers. So here are the 4 markers of emergency mode. Are you seeing those now? Somebody give me a thumbs up or something like that if you are.
Yes.
Great. So the 4 markers of emergency mode are a government or the leadership spends what it takes to win. Second, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Third, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And fourth, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of those things big time. And likewise, I think when you think about particularly the federal government response to the pandemic in the first year, they really did hit all 4 of those markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far at least, neither our federal government nor our any provincial government of any political stripe hits it's not just that they don't hit all the 4 markers, they don't hit any of the 4 markers. So I want to explore each of these markers with you, along with a couple others that I think are important lessons drawn from the Second World War experience as we face the emergency. So the first marker, spend what it takes to win. See, a benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. In the first year of the pandemic, we saw this in extraordinary government spending, and Canada's debt to GDP ratio as a consequence rose from about 30% to 50%. That's a big jump in a single year. Still doesn't hold a candle to World War II. We finished World War II with a debt to GDP ratio more than double that, well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe, who was the minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw Canada's incredible wartime military production, and when he was pressed about this ramp up in government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." To my mind, the extraordinary public spending that we saw in response to the pandemic has merely laid bare what we could have done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out when our governments recognize an emergency, the money's always there. But federal spending and provincial spending on climate action and green infrastructure, it pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic. Let me give you one stat comparison. In the whole first year of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response, the CERB and the wage subsidy, to the tune of $5 billion a week for most of a year. In contrast, the Trudeau government spending on climate is a little more than $5 billion, it's about $7 billion a year. So $5 billion a week, $7 billion a year. That's the difference. So the Trudeau government isn't merely spending a little less than it should on the face of the climate, in the face of the climate emergency. It's spending less, probably by a 10-fold order of magnitude, and so is the Oregon government. But let me, before I move on to the next marker, let's think for a moment about what this might mean for a post-secondary institution like Camosun. Is an appropriate share of your institution's budget being allocated to the emergency, particularly the capital budget for buildings, charging infrastructure, and converting vehicle fleets to electric? Like, does the spending align with the reality of the emergency, or is it incongruous? The second marker of emergency is you create new institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in our province, where we seem to struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced well over 300 ships, again, from a base of virtually nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of this guy, C.D. Howe, in order to expedite that incredible ramp up in production, established 28 crown corporations in order to meet that moment. Howe was a fascinating figure. He's no lefty, by the way. You know, he was on the right wing in the Mackenzie King cabinet. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector before going into politics, but he was seized with the task. He was in a hurry. And any time the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown enterprise. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. The provincial government is not creating new crown corporations to expedite what needs to be done. The Trudeau government has established 2 new crown corporations in its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and I hate to tell you what the other one is, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to our province. If our governments really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. What other new institutions might we imagine? One of the ideas I float in the book and I've written about since, and may be appealing to some of you on this call. What about a youth climate corps? Right, all of you who are in your post-secondary studies, but who are ready to meet this moment, right? And we've effectively said to you, well, wait and go do your studies. What if we created a youth climate corps for any young person who's finished high school, where they could spend 2 years in service of their country, maybe combining their post-secondary studies, but actually doing the work of meeting this moment? I think thousands of young people would want to do that. And is it an institution like Camosun? Are you creating special climate programs in major areas of study, not siloed off, but embedded in each faculty? Are you ramping up training that's going to be needed to transition our economy in every domain? Are you recruiting students for that? Like, it strikes me that if you were a student at a post-secondary institution during the war, everything about the experience drove that home to you every day? Does it feel like that? I suspect not yet. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. As I showed you earlier, Canada and BC's greenhouse gas emissions have basically just flatlined for the last 20 years. Why is that? I think a major reason is that if you survey our federal and provincial climate actions today, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates, we send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is actually require change. We are trying to incentivize our way to victory, and it's not going to work. If we are actually going to meet those steep GHG reduction targets we urgently need to, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. We would say, for example, that it will simply be illegal to buy or sell a new fossil fuel burning vehicle as of 2025, not 35 like they're talking about now. We would mandate that no new buildings can tie into gas lines as of next year, right? Not 2030 as they talk about now. We would make it the law that you can't advertise fossil fuel vehicles in gas stations. That just sends a contradictory message when we allow that kind of advertising. This is how we would make clear that we are serious about meeting this moment. And marker number 4, by the way, and the same is true again for your institution, right? Are you setting clear dates for ensuring that your buildings are zero emission, that your whole vehicle fleet is zero emission? Are the cafeterias on campus and mandated to change how they source their products? And is your pension fund, for those of you who are faculty and staff, are they setting clear dates for divesting from these fossil fuels? Because particularly as educators, when your pension funds remain invested in these fossil fuel companies, you are effectively betting against the future of your students. You only do well if they lose. And that's not why you're in this, is it? The 4th marker is tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. It took leadership to mobilize the public in the war. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis, yet still managed to impart hope. Their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, by an arts and entertainment sector keen to rally the public. And again, our governments more or less have modeled this kind of emergency communication in the pandemic, right? The messages are ubiquitous. We get daily press briefings, or at least weekly now. We hear regularly from health officials. The media takes seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. None of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure like pipelines or LNG plants, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. And that needs to end. And again, as a public education institution, telling the truth, well, that's your business, isn't it? Are your students and your faculty federation members, are you hearing that truth in a manner that aligns with this historic moment? Are your students feeling supported when they go on strike for the climate? Is both your faculty union and your leadership speaking up strongly to the provincial and federal government, demanding real and convincing and compelling climate action plans? I want to just share a couple other key lessons before we open this up to Q&A out of the book, beyond those 4 markers. Another one, and it's a thread through the whole book, is that that lesson around leaving no one behind. And that on the flip side, inequality is toxic to social solidarity and mass mobilization. There's climate policy purists out there who say, you know, don't link the fight on climate to tackling inequality or all these other social justice ills. Don't weigh it down. Don't make it any more complicated. This is hard enough as it is. I think they're wrong. First, they're wrong because these issues are inherently connected. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But second, we should link these issues because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. Let me give even further back in history. In the First World War, inequality undermined that mobilization. It undermined recruitment. It's partly why we had the conscription crisis. And so consequently, at the outset of the Second World War, the King government took these bold steps to lessen inequality and even to limit excess profits. The kind of outrageous profiteering that we've seen in the pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. As we saw the corporate tax rates go up and there was this excess profits tax. But on the flip side, we also saw the introduction of Canada's first major income support programs. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in the war. This famous Marsh report outlined, basically laying the infrastructure for the whole modern welfare state, was written during the war and was offered up to Canadians as a pledge and a promise that the society they would come back to would look different and be more just and more fair than the one they were leaving behind. That's when the mobilization happens across society. That's when they start hitting the recruitment numbers they needed. And the same is true again today. The effect of mobilization today isn't merely about building more planes or tanks then, or wind turbines and solar panels today. It requires policies that fulfill a promise that we will better look after one another, that we will guarantee good jobs and income supports, and that people will be treated with dignity and fairness. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how you get everyone on the bus. And I think that's why you see the tremendous appeal in public opinion of something like the Green New Deal. Package that links tackling inequality with tackling inequality. The support, when you combine those things, it doesn't reduce the support for bold climate action. In fact, the support goes through the roof. And the final lesson, and maybe this brings us full circle back to Della's opening, is that Indigenous leadership and title and rights are central to winning. Let me finish with a story of a World War II vet. One morning, as I was writing the book in 2019, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne. Interestingly, it had been important to the Canadian government to independently declare war in 1939, separate from Britain. Interestingly, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Oakes died at the age of 94. The code talkers were Indigenous soldiers who were tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among the Allied forces. In news reports after Oakes' death, his daughter revealed that, astonishingly, Oakes hadn't told his family what he did during the war for 7 decades, having been sworn to secrecy. Only in his late 80s, when stories of the code talkers were made more public, did he finally reveal what he'd done. And then he got a Congressional Silver Medal and special honors from the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian House of Commons. Oakes was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of others from Indigenous nations across North America. As the war was unfolding, the secret codes employed by the Allies kept getting broken. And then the Marines, the US Marines, discovered at a certain point that enemy forces were unable to crack Navajo. And ultimately, 33 Indigenous languages were used by various branches of the Allied forces, including a number from nations in Canada like the Mohawk language and Cree and Tlingit and Ojibwe. But as I learned about this, it struck me that there is, in this piece of wartime history, a tragic irony. Our two countries, Canada and the US, have spent generations trying to erase Indigenous languages from the earth, literally beating them out of children in residential schools, only to uncover that these languages were the unbreakable code. That's what they were dubbed in the war, credited as having been vital to victory in certain battles, particularly in the Pacific. And then if we fast forward to today, I think you can say the same about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent climate action over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous title and rights that keeps buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics comes into compliance with the science. In fact, just a few months ago, there was a report from Indigenous Environmental Network in the States and Oil Change International, which tried to tally up all of the carbon that stayed in the ground because of these Indigenous-led efforts. And they estimated it as about 25% of North American domestic emissions. Amazing. Final thought, and then we'll open this up to Q&A. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world we're leaving my kids and some of your kids and those who will live throughout most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to do what we need to do in time. But consider this. In the Second World War, Canada had a population at the time of about 11 million people. Over 1 million of those people enlisted. Remarkably, 64% of them were under the age of 21, like many of your students. But it's worth remembering, all of those people who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, you know what they didn't know? If they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how their story ended. They didn't. Yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving, not just on the battlefront, but on the home front too. I think that's the spirit we need today. Friends, these next 10 years or so, really fewer than that, are going to make it or break it for us and for our kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews. This is it. We're at the crossroads moment, and we have to decide what kind of people we want to be. All right, I'm going to stop there. Let's move this to Q&A. Can't hear you, Chris. We see your lips moving, but we can't hear you.
I'll jump in, Seth. Sorry, my voice is a bit off, so I was not on, but I can ask the first question.
Am I back?
Oh, you're back, Chris.
All right.
Yeah, it's a constant fight against the technology. So thank you so much, Seth, and thank you, Peter, for offering to rescue me there. The Q&A has been coming to life, and we've got some upvoting going on. So I'm going to start reading my way down through the question list, and we're going from the most votes on down. And, this may spark more questions in your mind, so just feel free to keep them coming, you in the audience, and you should be able to keep on voting. So at the top of the list here, we have what do you think is the most important change that post-secondary institutions can do to help the climate? The most important change.
I mean, I was trying to seed the talk with a bunch of ideas. I'm not really able to pick this way. What I'm trying to encourage you to do is use the 4-marker framework. If your college is declaring climate emergency, as many universities and colleges are, and yet they are all wrestling with what does that mean in practice, I invite you to employ the 4 markers as a framework for figuring out what that looks like. Are you spending what it takes to win? Are you creating those educational programs not siloed off, but that everyone who passes through your doors is getting enough exposure so that they are thinking about how in the careers that will follow their time with you, they will tackle this task of our lives. And are some of those mandatory? And all of the physical infrastructure has to align with the emergency, whether it's vehicles or buildings or food systems. And all of those will culminate in both your staff and students feeling like, as they walk through the doors of your buildings, their time with you aligns with the moment we're in, instead of feeling incongruous.
Great, thanks, Seth. Yes, I have to say that cutting through the noise is always a challenge, and I think that your 4 markers are a good tool for that. Okay, the next question at the top of the list: what is your advice for students or others who feel paralyzed by climate anxiety?
Sorry, I'm just slightly distracted here because I wanted to share in the chat some links. So link to the book, link to the Climate Emergency Unit, if people want to see what I'm up to now. And if you want to, I've got one link there that didn't come through. There's a link there about the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. And I want to share, if you give me a sec, a link for the newsletter specifically. If you want to stay abreast of what we are doing in the Climate Emergency Unit, there is, oh no, that didn't work. Hang on one sec. Here we go. There's to sign up for the newsletter. The idea of the Climate Emergency Unit is to create campaigns and coalition tables to animate the emergency ideas in the book. And so we're involved in a whole bunch of campaigns across the country and in British Columbia. Your question's a really good one. What I just said is actually the answer in a way. The surest antidote to feeling that anxiety is to engage in the fight. There is something powerful and mentally beneficial that comes from making common cause with others at a key moment. There is a story I like to point to, given, I'm a bit like everyone's, your weird uncle, always bringing things back to the war. In the Blitz, when the people of London were being bombed nightly in the early part of the war, the health professionals of the day were worried that this would be, devastating to everyone's mental health. And in fact, the opposite ended up being true. When people were invited to actually make common cause together to meet the moment, something positive happened. So it helps you when you do it. It also helps those around you. It helps your kids when they see you taking action. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I agree completely, and it matches my lived experience of now having a group to work on this is a big improvement on being isolated. The next question at the top of the list is now, okay, I hope you've got your anti-despair turned on. Is there really a chance of stopping climate disaster?
So climate works as a matter of degrees. As I started saying at the top of my talk, look at the year we just had. Even let me answer your question this way. I mentioned that I cut my teeth in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s as a teenager, and at that time the existential threat was of a global nuclear war, and a lot of young people lived with a lot of despair. But the thing about the nuclear threat was it either would happen or it wouldn't happen. And over time, thankfully, the odds of it happening diminished significantly. Climate doesn't work like that. Climate is a matter of degrees. It's already happening. And those disasters and hardships get progressively worse the more the temperature increases. So the 1 degree world we now live in, the 1 degree of warming that has already occurred, is already producing the kind of year we just had. A 1.5 degree world is worse. A 2 degree world is significantly worse and completely catastrophic for certain societies and cultures. And a 3 degree world is horrific across broad swaths of the planet. So we are not, it is the nature of climate change that we rag the puck for too long. You know, if we had moved on this in the early 90s like we could have avoided a lot, but we didn't. So particularly for all of the younger folks on this call who are still students, as I say, there's no getting around the fact that this is going to be the defining issue of your life. You're going to be experiencing stuff. But it is also true that if we can take concerted efforts today, the degree of that is substantially less bad than if we don't. And, you know, sometimes I use the metaphor that, you know, what causes global warming and climate change isn't the emissions each year. It's the accumulation of those emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's what is functioning as a blanket across, heat trapping blanket around the world. Our task in the next few years is, you can think of emissions each year as like the tap of a bathtub, and the accumulation of the water in the bathtub is actually what causes climate change. Our task in the next few years is to turn off the damn tap in order to give our kids and grandkids a fighting chance. They're still going to have to figure out how to get a bunch of that accumulated water out of the atmosphere, just to mix my metaphors. But if we don't turn off the tap, they don't have a chance.
Okay, thank you, Seth. Looking at the list now, we have a few questions that are tied in terms of their number of votes. So I'm going to exercise my privilege here and pick one that's a little different. How would you address the opposition that mandatory climate policies would face?
Great question, very timely question. Here's how I would address it. Whether it's the war or the pandemic or climate, you never get unanimity. There is always an antisocial rump of public opinion that often is not nearly as big as it sounds. It's noisy, but it's not as big as it sounds. And that's fine. You're never going to get unanimity. So there wasn't unanimity in the war. There was an antisocial, there was even a fascistic rump of opinion. But we did what we had to do regardless. Clearly, in the pandemic, we do not have unanimity. You get this vocal minority that oppose mandatory measures, and the same will be true in climate. But let me offer these observations. First of all, change often begins this way. I'm old enough to remember. I remember when mandatory seatbelts came in. I remember when it was made illegal to smoke in bars and restaurants, and all of these things. You know, initially you had this huge pushback. People thought it was an incredible infringement on their civil liberties. The restaurant industry thought that it was going to collapse them. And then the change happened. And in the space of months, it just becomes normalized and accepted. I actually think that in the main, these mandatory measures are popular and supported. And they are supported because, in the main, most of us want to do the right thing by our fellow citizens. But it irks us that we would do the right thing and our neighbor wouldn't, right? Because none of us wants to be a chump, right? We don't want to think, oh, we're going to do the right thing on climate, we're going to do the right thing on the pandemic, but our next door neighbor isn't. That's the beauty of mandatory measures, is that it liberates you from that problem. You don't need to worry about your neighbor because they're not going to have choice. The other neat thing about mandatory measures is that it can create that sense that we're all doing our part. At the beginning of the war, the governments of Canada and the UK and the US, one of the policies they most feared was rationing. They were worried that when they brought in rationing, they would be met with a kind of popular revolt. Didn't happen. In fact, rationing in all of those countries ended up being one of the most popular things that the government did. Popular because, first of all, everyone felt like they could do their bit towards that collective effort. And also popular because everyone had comfort that the system was fair, that everyone was having to do their bit, regardless of where they were on the social economic order. So I leave that with you.
Thank you, Seth. I'm going to exercise my privilege again and ladder off that question, because something I often think of is that, I think an obstacle to effective action in Canada is that we're privileged to be a democratic society. How can we make climate a central and winning political issue that will, be something that political parties want to latch on to? And overcome that election cycle sort of fear that they seem to operate from.
Yeah, I mean, and it is, one of the curse of climate is that it moves in slow motion. And so in a system like ours, there's this tendency of leaders to kick the can down the road and not want to bite off the hard stuff and leave it for somebody else. Although I would say that's been more so true in Canada than elsewhere. In fact, let me just share one other slide with you. People often have the impression, oh, it's so hard and at least we're doing better than others. No, we're not. That's Canada's record on greenhouse gas emissions going back to 1990 compared to every other G7 country. We're the worst by a long shot. And it's interesting, you'll note there, the G7 countries that have made the most progress on lowering their greenhouse gas emissions, Germany and the UK, a lot of that even happened under conservative governments. So something unfortunate has happened in North America, where conservative parties have chosen to kind of weaponize the climate fight and turn it into a political wedge issue. That has not been true in other places. But I also think there are things that you can do to increase that popular buy-in, because we do want this to unfold in a democratic way. One of the ideas I mentioned in the book is, and it's something that Extinction Rebellion calls for as well, is the much broader use of citizen assemblies. Because while our targets need to be based on science, what we the amount of GHG emissions that we urgently need, that shouldn't be up for debate. We need to listen to the scientists. But how we meet those targets should be the outcome of some careful deliberation and thoughtfulness, and so that people can have comfort that it's unfolding in a way that is fair. And often a citizen assembly is a good way to do that, and it can provide sort of political cover to nervous governments, because part of what makes citizen assemblies interesting is the public is prepared to heed the advice and recommendations of their fellow citizens in a way that they often aren't with politicians. But we also need politicians to just be brave. I do mention, we do have some climate champions in this country politically. I personally think my wife's one of them. She's a Vancouver city councillor. She's the city councillor who introduced the climate emergency motion in Vancouver. She has done a bunch of things on the climate front that, if you're a mainstream political advisor, you would say, don't do that. That's like touching a third rail in politics that she's just gone ahead and grabbed a hold of. And next October, we'll find out what the political outcome of that is. But I think people are ready to reward that kind of bravery.
Well, I agree with you there. And I will say that the student climate strike that happened in the September right before the pandemic was the most optimistic I've felt pretty well since the 1980s. And I think there's a lot of energy still out there as soon as we're allowed to get together in groups again. Okay, let's see what we have here. We still got some time and we still have some questions. So next we have, how do we as individuals help others understand that we are indeed in a climate emergency and mobilize?
So the question of, where's the public at is an interesting one. So the good news is that when you look at the polling, I've commissioned some and looked at others. We have seen a shifting in the terrain of public opinion in the last few years, and a majority of Canadians do actually get the climate crisis. And the share, and conversely, the share of Canadians who are kind of out and out climate deniers is a tiny rump. It's about 7%. So the public is anxious. The public wants bolder action. The public is in fact ahead of our politics in terms of their readiness of bold action. That's the good news. The bad news, and maybe this is an important piece of a educational institution like Camosun, is that the basic level of climate literacy is very poor. In fact, only about half of Canadians understand that the main source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. And so that's why when you're polling people and you say, are you worried about the climate? Yes. Do you think the government should do more? Yes. What do you think they should do? And they go right to plastics and recycling because that's what's been hardwired in the public conversation for the last 20 years. And so we do need to boost that level of climate literacy. We do need our educational institutions, our government institutions, our media. You know, I wish there was a morning climate emergency report every morning on the radio, like we do every hour on sports and business, telling us how this battle for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad. You know, that's kind of what we had in the war. A media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, as I said in my talk. And that would certainly help. But the good news is the public is ready.
Okay, great. Thanks, Seth. So just in terms of a time check, it's 5:45, and 6 is our official end time. So I think we still have time for a few more if you've got the stamina, Seth. We still have most of our crowd, you know, sticking around, which is, I think, shows this is going all right. And I also just want to note, in case I forgot earlier, that our friend Frank is going to be revealing some winners of door prizes before too long. So, you know, if you were thinking of bailing, that's a reason to stay. Okay, so the next most popular question is in a different direction. What do you think about nuclear energy to replace fossil fuels?
Oh, another good question comes up a fair bit. I'm going to reach back into that World War II history again. We had a conscription referendum in World War II in which the slogan employed by the King government was conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. That's kind of how I feel about nuclear. Nuclear if necessary, but not necessarily nuclear. I certainly don't think we should be closing any nuclear plants, given the window of time that we have. But on the question of whether or not we should have new nuclear, I have to tell you, I'm doubtful that that is a piece of the solution. And I say that because everything about the next few years has to be about speed and scale. And the costs of nuclear and the regulatory hurdles faced by nuclear, the time it takes to get approvals, the opposition at the community level, all of that mitigates against speed and scale. Sometimes I invite people to think, would you rather have a wind farm in your community or a nuclear plant? And the answer to that question tells you about as much as you need to know about which of those technologies is likely to help with speed and scale.
Okay, thank you. I'm browsing down the list now with a view to things that are a little different, just to mix it up. And here's one that grabs my attention, although I guess I'm not being quite so democratic anymore. You say on page 376 of your book, deficits be damned. How would you address the resulting inflation? And I might add, perhaps backlash.
Yeah. So the pandemic experience was an interesting one. Like, as I said earlier in the talk, the Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities the whole first year of the pandemic to the tune of $5 billion a year. I don't actually think we need that much spending for climate. I've said as a target, we should be spending 2% of GDP. That's what Nicholas Stern calls for on climate action. In Canada, that's about $40 billion a year. Trudeau's only spending 7. I think we need 40. Think about that number, 40 billion. What I'm basically saying is what the Bank of Canada did during the pandemic for a year, I think they should do for 8 weeks a year. And we will have the money that we need. And I don't believe it would be inflationary. And if there were inflationary pressures, there are other things that a government can do to tackle inflation. And they did them during the war. We had wage and price controls during the war. Like there's lots of ways we can go about that. And the fact that we are now experiencing inflation, I think, I don't believe it is stemming from that pandemic spending. I think there's a whole bunch of complicating factors.
Okay, thank you, Seth. Let's see. Here's another one that has a fair number of votes. I hear your argument about what our governments must do, and I find it very compelling. But when I consider what individuals and communities must do, I think it's probably taking nonviolent direct action. I wonder about your thoughts on what individuals can or must do to get governments to act. I guess that's a bit like a question I asked earlier, but the way it's posed has me thinking about Fairy Creek, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think the questioner's quite right. When I say that speed and scale has to be state-led, it was in the war, it was in the pandemic, it needs to be again on climate, and yet we're not seeing it. And so this is a political moment where we have to be pressing our leaders into that emergency mode. And for those of you for whom that looks like taking peaceful civil disobedience in order to press for that to happen, then more power to you. Great. I can't think of a successful social movement that didn't involve peaceful civil disobedience as part of the equation and finally bringing about the changes that needed to happen.
Thank you. Okay. We're at 10 to 6, and I think I'm not going to maybe get to every single one because I do want to leave a few minutes for closing remarks and for maybe for Frank to do his thing. But why don't I try to pose 2 or 3 more? If you think that we can make that happen?
Sure, and then yeah, I wouldn't mind just offering a final thought too.
Okay, absolutely. So, well, why don't we make this the last one? Or no, we'll make it 2. Here comes one that's another energy question. Well, no, I take it back. It's a different kind of an approach. Any thoughts on solar geoengineering?
Solar geoengineering.
Geoengineering, yes.
Yeah. I don't pretend to be expert on it. It makes me nervous. Let me answer the question this way. There is maybe an understandable tendency for many of us to lock on to these technological fixes that will be like a get out of jail free card, that we don't have to do the hard work of ending our reliance on fossil fuels. For some people, that's nuclear. For some people, it's geoengineering. For some people, it's carbon capture and sequestration, or giant sucking machines that pull carbon out of the air. Look, I hope some of these things prove successful, but I'm not willing to roll the dice on them. We have to do our work. Our task in the next few years is to end our reliance on fossil fuels and end emissions. It's already the case that the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere is too high. And those who come after us are still going to have to figure out, through some combination of technology and restoration of nature's capacities, to suck a bunch of that carbon out of the atmosphere and bring us back to a safe level of 350 parts per million. But the latter isn't a substitute for the hard work we now have to do. It's additional.
Okay, great. Thank you. I had a very interesting interaction with some geoengineering researchers at a conference one time. And what surprised me was that they actually say they have a lot of trouble getting funding because apparently everybody feels a bit that way, nervous about that work. I was a bit surprised to hear that. All right, let's call this the last one, and I must say I'm picking it more or less at random. In fact, I'm going to go with the very last one on the list just to flip things. So here we go. Excellent point about speed and scale. Also significant is the financial and environmental cost of building plants and mining and refining uranium. You have to dig a pretty deep hole before you can start filling it back in again. I guess that's more of a comment on the nuclear thing than a question, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's consequences. There's all kinds of things with nuclear that we haven't figured out yet.
Right. Okay, well, look,
And, I mean, maybe I take from the question that even with a lot of the, you know, electric batteries and solar technology, like there's an environmental impact on all of these solutions, just to acknowledge that. Although the economic impact of solar and wind and EVs is certainly not as high as fossil fuels. And so the answer, let's take this from the question. And this is a point I try to make in the book. The answer is not to simply swap out everything we do now with fossil fuels and make it electric with renewables instead. We also have to change how we live. We have to change how we build our cities. We have to change not just what we get around in, but how we get around. And we have to consume less and change what's important in our lives. That to me is part of the appeal of the Green New Deal as well. You know, for all of us who feel compelled to make so much money and buy so much stuff, and you know, we think we have to make so much money, the Green New Deal is also about changing the balance of what we do on our own and what we do together. And it's about saying, you know, all of that stress you feel, make so much money to cover your kids' childcare and your kids' post-secondary education, your grandparents' elder care, and your retirement, and chill out about all those things. We're going to do those things together in a different way. That's part of the solution too.
Well,
should I segue into a closing comment?
Absolutely, please do.
First of all, it's great that so many of you have stuck around for the whole hour and a half here. Thank you again for your time. You've heard me make a bunch of comparisons with the pandemic, but I want to highlight a notable difference between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment. People talk a lot about COVID fatigue. That's real. And some people have responded to my thesis by saying, you know, look how quickly everyone tired of the emergency and the pandemic in less than a year. And here I am asking people to spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things that we have been called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. To isolate, to stay home. That's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. I also want to come back one last time to the war. You know, some of you folks study or teach history. And like me, you know, you kind of dig into these historic examples. I know I'm not alone. Like if you look at your Netflix streams or the shelves of any bookstore, it's filled with all of these reboots of World War II stuff, right? I mean, there's so many of them. So clearly there's a big audience for this stuff. Why is that? I mean, I think when a lot of people watch these films about these key historic moments or read a book and get, you know, when you go to bed at night, you close the book, you turn off the TV, there's a question in your head. And the question is, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? But here's the thing, you don't really need to wonder, because a civilizational threat is again on our doorstep. And the future of our kids and grandkids is cast again into doubt. The answer to that question of what would I do if I lived then and there is whatever we're each ready to do now. This is it. So I invite you to again, sign up on our newsletter and hear about our campaigns. But a key piece of this is thinking about what are the key institutions in your life. So where you live, you know, politically, municipally, provincially, federally. your post-secondary institutions, your faith institutions, your union, whatever. And what does it look like to press your leadership into emergency mode? So thanks.
Well, I hope you can all locate your clapping hands buttons. I don't know if that's a feature we have in the webinar, but I will clap mine and quietly. And I want to just thank you very sincerely, Seth, for taking the time to give us that talk and answer our questions. And I couldn't agree more with the way that you've just concluded. I feel like that's the moment in history that we're at, where, you know, there's something that absolutely each of us can be doing. It's not necessarily the stuff that we were led to believe it should be, like just changing our light bulbs, but I think that your book provides a really good, source of inspiration and also ideas for practical action. And I really hope it's the start of some significant stuff at Camosun. I think we've got some energy here and some people that want to get some things done and some real opportunities. So thank you very much. And I really want to thank everybody who came. You know, it's maybe not we didn't quite reach the 1,000 participant max that this webinar was capable of, but considering how fatigued and isolated everybody's been, I think this is a good turnout, a really diverse crowd, and I'm really impressed with the staying power of everyone and your interest in the questions. There are ways to connect and keep the messages and keep the momentum going. Seth provided some of his own information in the chat. I'm wondering whether Amanda Garner is still here from the Student Society. She might be able to provide contact information, but if there are students looking for ways to band together, the Student Society has a sustainability division, which Amanda runs. For us who are part of this C4 group, you can certainly look me up, or my co-chair, Ian Browning, has been on the call here, and we're just waiting for your emails. And wow, well, I think that about does it. Now, I promised Frank that he was going to get a chance to just say something about door prizes. Frank, do you want to jump on here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So it's been suggested to end the recording, Chris, just to observe privacy. So maybe we'll stop that now.
Okay,
if you can.
absolutely.